Thanks for listening to the Granite List Live. Today's episode is brought to you by Connect Healthcare Collaboration, where benefits marketing meets clinical advocacy to drive effective employee engagement. This is the Granite List Live, where we explore all things human capital and employee benefits related. I'm your host, Sally Pace, and today I'm joined by Hans Kulberg, who is the founder and CEO of Avocado Health. Hans, I am really excited about today's episode. You and I have had the chance to get to know each other. We met a couple of months ago, and as a working parent myself, am so inspired by, grateful for the work that you and the team do. Can we introduce the company and the concept to our audience?
Well, first and foremost, it's an honor and real pleasure to be with you here today, Sally, and thank you for having me on. So Avocado Health, we're a parenting support platform, kind of called the parent coach in your pocket, able to answer and address any kind of parent concerns, challenges, and questions throughout the life cycle of that parenthood journey. So whether you're family planning, or child's in utero, maybe 3 months old, 3 years old, 13, or 30 years old, we know that the challenges and the questions are plenty. But a lot of times those answers are very hard to come by. And many times that stress and anxiety that goes with parenting actually spills over into the workplace. And so really addressing this for employers is really core to our mission, and making sure that parents are well supported by getting the information that they need at the right time. And that's via text message. So SMS text message, which is the most accessible form of communication on the planet, period.
Absolutely. Over half of the workforce, 60% of the workforce, is made up of parents. So from an employer perspective, it's a really crucial component to address, because you all are in the business of solving presenteeism with effective support for parents, for working parents. So can we talk a little bit about that presenteeism issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So while 60% of an employee population are working parents, we know 35% have children under the age of 18. However, if you're concerned about developmental delays, or you're concerned about your child's anxiety or depression or mental health issues, or if you're a brand new parent and you can't get your kid to sleep at night, or dealing with temper tantrums, right? There's a vast array of different problems and issues that parents have. However, where do they go for information and that support and guidance? Ideally, they'd love to go to the pediatrician, but oftentimes you can't get in touch with them for days, if not weeks at a time. And you're not going to call your pediatrician at 2 a.m. when your kid's not sleeping. So the number one source that parents actually do go is Dr. Google, followed by Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and others. That's a scary proposition. And given that there's lots of misinformation online, that can be guided in the wrong direction. So you see this big gap between validated clinical-based information and really accessible information. So that's the gap that we're really bridging at Avocado Health. And with regards to presenteeism for employers, it's one of the biggest, most, I would say, amorphous costs that the employers do know of. It's a big gorilla in the room, but they don't know how to actually address it, nor even measure it. But what you do have is, we know that parents are coming in sleep deprived at work, or maybe they're online, or they're searching around on TikTok or Instagram because they don't have the answers to their child's question, or even leaving to go to a pediatric visit. There's a lot of different reasons that they're not fully present in terms of your mind share, in terms of actually being able to be the most productive self and colleague that they can on the job. And so that averages around $8,000 a year. Obviously depends on salary range and everything else. But in terms of addressing that big issue, we believe that supporting those parents is probably one of the biggest drivers that is really causing presenteeism issues.
And you've led a very successful career in the fintech space. You were head of innovation for Visa, and this is drastically different. And I know you're a father of 5 yourself. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your story and what led you to build Avocado Health?
Absolutely. Really, with Avocado Health, our mission is to really empower parents with accessible, personalized, and actionable parenting support. And our vision is really to become the most trusted parenting platform on the planet. How are we going to do that? And why is this such a critical mission for me? Is deeply personal. As you said, I'm a father of 5, but when our third child, Aviva, was born, her second week of life, she actually woke up from a nap And she was lethargic. She was cold to the touch. She was 95 degrees. We brought her to the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, and they saw that she had bradycardia, which means a slow heart rate, about 60 beats a minute versus 150. Doctors there, who lived in Northern California at the time, they did all types of tests under the sun, pokes, prods, everything else, but weren't able to figure out an answer, an underlying diagnosis after a week of tests, genetics and everything else. And so over the next 10 months of her life, she was able to develop normally and healthily. However, every single time we went for hospital stays of 4 or 5 days at a time, the doctors were left with more questions and answers. They weren't able to give us any kind of objective differential diagnosis for her condition. And it was very sporadic. It wasn't all the time. It was just once in a blue moon, about once every 3 months. And on her sixth hospitalization down here in San Diego, she had a little bit higher levels of potassium in her blood. Thought it was just going to be a routine stay in the hospital. A little bit different instance this time. She was actually vomiting a lot. And so that was a different concern. We thought maybe it was a flu or sickness that she could have had. However, she had a little bit higher levels of potassium in her blood. And what that meant, potassium, if you don't know, is what they use in the syringe and the death penalty. If you have too much of that, it could actually stop your heart, full stop. And so they try to give her an injection to reverse that. It actually had the opposite effect, and her potassium levels went up, skyrocketed. That stopped everything, stopped her organs and everything else. And they put her on life support, something called an ECMO machine. We waited for 24 hours for a miracle to occur. And as a father, this was certainly the most excruciating pain that any parent can ever live through, and humans for that matter. After about 24 hours, there weren't any signs, and she passed away. And so they gave us a few hours with her right at the end. I held her, and as a father, as most parents would say, their number one job is to make sure their children are happy, healthy, and safe. Some order of that. And so for me, the pain was beyond, just excruciating. But the promise that I made to my daughter, Aviva, was that Daddy doesn't know what happened, but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure no other parent has to feel the same way. And even to this day, almost 5 years later, we still don't have answers to her particular diagnosis. After all autopsy and everything else, we don't know if we ever will. However, for me, that really planted the seed and the promise to my daughter to make sure every single parent has an answer to their question, period. And parents have a very big role to be the best advocate they can for their child, for patient advocacy. They can't speak up on their behalf. It has to be the parent. And getting the right information, the right resources, the right knowledge, and in the right moment, it makes a world of difference. And I know that firsthand. And that's why I'm intrinsically hugely motivated to make sure that every parent has that.
Absolutely. I think as parents, we sometimes will put our own health on the back burner, but we'll never do that for our children. And you're living proof of that. But it's also something that not everyone is comfortable certainly talking about or bringing to work with them. So from an employer's perspective, can you talk about the circumstances and challenges that employers might not even be aware of when they're thinking about the current ways that they're addressing workplace productivity and presenteeism and parenting support?
Yeah. What I will say is that employers, they really don't know. And a lot of times it's really flying under the radar and undercover in terms of these challenges that parents do go through. So in my own experience, 10 and a half months of my daughter's life, I was in and out of work. I was definitely taking off time. But even when I was at work, I was searching WebMD and Google and everything else, trying to figure out answers for her. So I wasn't fully present in effect. And so I know that affects millions of parents across the US all the time, because whether you're concerned about your child having autism, for instance, a lot of times that's a huge stigma that they don't even talk to their doctors about. They don't even want to bring that topic up to pediatricians, yet they're willing to go and ask Dr. Google about that online. And so what we're doing is really taking that user behavior, type in a question, get an answer, and we're moving it from Google, which is random and a lot of misinformation, to a more validated way in a more accessible format even than the internet, which is text message. 30% of pediatric visits are actually preventable. if that parent has the right information at the right time. A lot of times, most parents will err on the side of caution and take their kid to the ER or the urgent care if primary isn't open or available to actually see them. That's a much bigger ticket cost from a medical cost perspective for employers. And then finally, what I'll say, there's a huge trend, and I think very positive trend, around maternal health, prenatal, IVF, family planning, and even maternity leave, which is really great for employers. But I think what employers don't think about enough is how are we actually supporting mom and dad, but especially moms, when they do come back to work 6 months later, 3 months later. We know that there's a 70% higher rate of attrition if a mom has a concern about her child, period, but especially with development, where 20% of kids have some type of delay, whether it's speech or autism or cerebral palsy or ADHD, right? That mom's going to actually leave the workforce, and especially if it doesn't make sense, from a cost perspective for daycare and babysitting even. But that parent is going to put their number one job as a priority. And that's what employers really should know, because you might have the best workplace in the world. You might have the most theoretically supportive workplace in the world, but most parents I know are going to choose their child over their job when it comes down to something that is critical enough for them to actually leave the workforce. So what we're trying to do for employers is we're going to help protect their investment by helping parents fulfill their number one job at the end of the day.
Absolutely. So from a tactical standpoint, can you paint a picture of how somebody would engage in the Avocado Health platform? And then also talk a little bit about the financials behind it, what an employer's cost is, the individual cost. How does that all work?
Yeah, no, so and from a tactical perspective, we've thought, very constructively about how to actually implement this and making sure that it is very easy to implement, knowing that HR has defined constraints when it comes down to implementation. So apart from the marketing materials and videos and everything else, what we do is we take an opt-out approach where every single parent employee is actually opted in already, but we're able to hold their hand and guide them through that process, not having to use additional HR resources, but being able to do that via text message. And so taking them through a 30-day SMS text message campaign, maybe 10 different text messages in that, where all they have to do is really understand what we're doing and make sure that we're top of mind if and when they do have any kind of questions. And so that could be as benign as, hey, how do I get my child to eat broccoli? Or maybe something serious like, I'm having issues with my partner. Do you have any strategies around that, right? We span the spectrum from developmental, behavioral, minor medical, relationship-based, right, sleep issues, et cetera. But in terms of, streamlining that onboarding is a really, we've taken a very thoughtful approach. And for employers, while we know therapists cost an arm and a leg, parent coach, could be $200, even $300 per hour. We're coming in at a very, what we think is attractive price point between $1 to $5 PM, in the sense of being able to, depending on group size, be there with that support at the right place at the right time, 24/7, 365, having the historical context of what that parent and family has been going through, not just in that particular conversation, but we actually index past 12 months, past 24 months. And being able to do that helps us personalize where that child stands, not only age-wise, but also developmentally, and then also any other concerns. And so there's lots of different hidden pieces that we're able to pick up, and then we're able to kind of infuse any kind of answer that we have. We lead with empathy, being able to kind of come across like a parent coach or like a therapist. Having a user experience is like having a conversation with your best friend, who's the most knowledgeable therapist, parent coach, pediatrician that you know, with that right information.
Speaking about some of the hidden implications and some of the stressors, it's certainly no secret that the mental health crisis is real in our country. And just given the sheer numbers, parents are impacted by it, as are the children that they're raising. So what does Avocado Health do to address the mental health in addition to the physical health?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you were to ask, the average person on the street, what's the biggest healthcare crisis that we're dealing with this day and age here in the US, most of them would say the mental health care crisis, right? However, we know in our healthcare system is a very reactive system, right? It's only, if there's a problem, address it with a solution. I do think there's a very positive trend, and it's really grown since COVID, with employers actually supporting their employees and their family with mental health resources. However, when you ask someone, when does mental health actually start? Most of the time they'll say something around the teenage years, maybe in the 20s, right? But that answer is patently false because mental health starts at day zero, even in utero. A lot of those foundations for that individual, for that child, are built around the formative early years. Really, the first 3 years, 80% of your child's brain actually develops. They're hitting over 400 different milestones from social, emotional, cognitive, language, and movement. As parents, you and I probably know that walking, talking, sitting, rolling over, right? But we're not as in tune with banging two objects together, which is as important as walking is, or looking when someone calls their name. That could be an indication of autism if they're not able to do that. But being able to pick up on that at an early age makes a lot of sense. Just to give you a table stakes, autism, for instance, at 2 years old versus 5 years old. At 2 years old, one could actually have a diagnosis then. But many times that average age of diagnosis is at 5. That's a $1.5 million cost difference over the lifetime cost of care for that child. Meaning, who's actually paying for that? That's not usually mom and dad. That's usually the payer. In many cases, it's the employer. Employers will right now have a misguided assumption that, well, that child will have autism either way. There's nothing we can do about it. No, that's absolutely wrong. There's a lot of times that child could actually graduate from ABA therapy or certainly have much more improved outcomes on the whole with a much more proactive approach. And so the last thing I'll say is 70% of kids with some type of developmental delay end up having a mental health issue later in life. And so you think about a 2-year-old that isn't able to say a word. Most of the times pediatricians will say, hey, let's just take a wait and see approach. Every child is unique and they develop differently. However, their next appointment is at 3 years old, 12 months passes in between. That child's not able to communicate, socialize with their friends in preschool. That builds the seeds for social emotional deficiencies, whether it's anxiety or depression, and impacts even their teenage years just from having that 12-month delay, which at 3 years old, if you're not talking, is a really, really huge issue. And so really getting in front of that, making sure that parents are more proactive on that, can able to be the best advocate for their child is really important and essential to address not just mental health for the child, but also for parents in a big way by reducing a lot of that stress and anxiety. So we see it at both ends of the spectrum in terms of what we're doing.
Well, Hans, I'm confident I can speak on behalf of the parents in our country that we are eternally grateful that you have built this incredible resource. But also from an employer's perspective, you're addressing one of the number one challenges that employers are facing with working parents, and that is presenteeism, because as you gracefully outlined, those of us that are working parents, when there is an issue with our child, it's just impossible to not have that as top of mind because it is our number one job. We at the Granite List are so proud of the work that you and the team are doing at Avocado Health. We're so glad that you're part of our community. And we want to encourage our listeners to not only look up Avocado Health on the Granite List, but also visit their website at avocadohealth.ai to learn more about the work that Hans and his crew are doing. Hans, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Sally. I really appreciate it.
And thank you all to our audience for tuning into another episode of the Granite List Live.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Granite List Live. Access our entire library by visiting your favorite podcast venue or subscribe on our site, thegranitelist.live.